He fired me in front of everyone, not knowing I owned the building, not knowing that the lease agreement sitting in my bag, the one his company had been renewing every single year for the past 11 years, had my name on it, not knowing that the quiet, overlooked woman he was screaming at in front of 43 employees had inherited every single floor of that building 31 days ago. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to stay with me, because this is not just a story about revenge, although I won't pretend that part doesn't feel good to tell. This is a story about what happens when you spend years making yourself small so that other people feel comfortable, and then one day life hands you something so undeniable, so irrefutable, that you cannot make yourself small anymore, even if you tried. And before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from right now. Are you at work, on your lunch break, sitting in a parking lot before you walk back into a place that makes you feel like you disappear? I read every single comment, every one, because stories like this don't just belong to me. They belong to every person who has ever been talked down to by someone who assumed they had nothing, who has ever been underestimated so completely that when the moment came, the real moment, the other person never even saw it coming. So let me start at the very beginning. Not the day he screamed at me, not the day I picked up the intercom, but the day I first walked into that building as a nobody, or at least as someone everyone decided was a nobody, and quietly started learning everything about the place I would one day own. My name is Renata Owusu, and the first thing you should know about me is that I have never in my entire adult life looked the way people expected power to look. I'm not tall, I don't have a commanding voice, I don't walk into rooms and demand attention. I grew up watching my grandmother do the most extraordinary things in the quietest ways, raise 6 children after her husband left, build a small catering business from a single pot and a folding table, buy a house in a neighborhood people said wasn't for people like her, and she did all of it without ever once raising her voice or adjusting herself to fit the shape of what anyone expected. She used to say, "Renata, the loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid." I didn't fully understand that when I was young. I understand it completely now. I started working at Callaway & Pierce, a mid-sized marketing and brand consulting firm, 7 years ago as an administrative coordinator, which is a polished way of saying I managed schedules, handled correspondence, coordinated meetings, ordered lunches, fixed the printer when everyone else pretended they didn't know how, and generally kept the machine running while the people the machine was built around got the credit. I was good at it, exceptionally good, and I want to say that clearly because there is a version of this story where I play the role of the secretly brilliant woman who was wasted in a small position, and that's partly true, but it's not the whole truth. I was genuinely skilled at the work I was hired to do. I took it seriously. I showed up early and stayed late and knew every person's spouse and child and coffee order because I believed that care, real, specific, personal care, was a form of competence. And I was right. I just wasn't working for someone who could see it. His name was Greg Callaway, son of the man who founded the company. He had inherited the title of managing director the way some people inherit furniture, not because it fit him, but because it was already in the house. He was 51 years old with the energy of someone who had never once been told no and the emotional range of a weather system, mostly mild with unpredictable storms that left other people cleaning up the damage. Greg did not like me. I want to be careful here because I spent a long time trying to figure out the specific reason, and eventually I came to understand that it wasn't specific at all. He didn't like me the way some people don't like a mirror, not because of anything the mirror has done, but because of what they see in it. I was quiet where he wanted noise. I was precise where he was careless. I remembered things. I noticed things. And I think somewhere underneath all of that bluster and entitlement, Greg Callaway sensed that the woman scheduling his meetings knew more about how his company actually functioned than he did. And that terrified him. So instead of being threatened, he chose a much easier emotion. He chose dismissal. For 7 years, Greg Calloway looked through me like a window. He would walk past my desk without acknowledgement. He would introduce new clients to every person in the room and skip me entirely, even when I was standing directly in front of him. He once, and I still think about this, presented a client retention strategy in a board meeting that I had written in full in a memo 3 weeks earlier, word for word. He did not mention my name. When I quietly brought it up afterward, he said, "Good ideas are institutional, Renata. No one owns a good idea." And he walked away. I did not quit. People always ask me that. Why didn't I just leave? And the answer is layered. Part of it was practical. The job paid well, the benefits were good, and I was supporting not just myself, but helping my mother with her medical bills after her diagnosis. Part of it was stubbornness, a deep, quiet refusal to let someone like Greg Calloway push me out of something I had helped build. And part of it, and this is the part I don't always say out loud, I was watching. I had been watching for years. The company, yes, but also the building. Because the building, that tall glass and brick building on Meridian Avenue that housed Calloway and Pierce on its 7th and 8th floors, that building belonged to someone I knew. His name was Edmund Park, and he was the most unremarkable-looking, remarkable man I have ever encountered in my life. I met him in the elevator on my 3rd day of work. He was 74 years old, small, slightly hunched, wearing a cardigan that's seen better decades, carrying a paper bag that smelled like a specific kind of Korean food I recognized immediately because my grandmother used to make something similar. He smiled at me. I smiled back. He asked if I was new. I said yes. He asked if I liked the building. I said I thought it was beautiful. He looked up at the ceiling of the elevator, at the ornate detailing that most people never noticed because they were staring at their phones, and he said, "It is, isn't it? I always loved this ceiling." I asked if he worked in the building. He said in the mildest possible way, "I own it." I didn't believe him immediately. He did not look like what I thought a building owner looked like. But that, of course, was my own bias showing its face, the same bias that had been applied to me every day I walked through those doors. I apologized internally and introduced myself properly. He introduced himself as Edmund, just Edmund, and that was how it started. For the next 6.5 years, Edmund Park and I had what I can only describe as an unexpected friendship. We ran into each other in the elevator, in the lobby, occasionally at the small cafe on the ground floor, where he came every Tuesday and Thursday without fail and ordered the same thing, black coffee, 1 almond croissant, the newspaper in print because he didn't trust screens with his eyes. I started timing my breaks around his visits, not intentionally at first, and then very intentionally. He was extraordinary. He had come to this country from South Korea at the age of 19 with $200 and a cousin's address on a piece of paper. He had worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 6 years. He had saved and invested with a discipline that he described as simple. I just never bought anything I didn't need and never sold anything that was growing. He had purchased his first property at 29, the building on Meridian Avenue at 45. He had never married. He had a nephew in California he was close to, and a network of people he quietly helped, former tenants who'd fallen on hard times, scholarship funds he never put his name on, a community garden 2 blocks away that most people didn't know he funded entirely. He never talked about his money. He talked about buildings like they were living things, their histories, their bones, the way a good structure holds its shape under pressure. He talked about people with the same attention. He was interested in everyone, and he was, without performance or fanfare, one of the kindest people I have ever sat across from. He knew about Greg. Of course he did. Edmund knew everything that happened in his building in the calm, attentive way of someone who has learned to listen more than he speaks. He never said anything critical. He just asked questions.
"How do you manage that?" he'd ask, or "What do you do when that happens?" And he'd listen to my answers with his full attention, nodding slowly like he was filing something away. 18 months ago, Edmund called me on a Tuesday, not our usual cafe day, and asked if I'd come see him in his office on the building's top floor. I'd never been up there. It was a small, warm room full of books and plants and framed photographs, and a desk that looked like it had been making decisions for 40 years. He offered me coffee, he sat across from me, and he told me he had been diagnosed with a condition that was progressing faster than expected, and that he had been thinking very carefully for a long time about the building. He said he had no children. His nephew, whom he loved, had no interest in property management and had his own life fully built in California. He had considered selling. He had considered several options. And then he said, "But the building deserves someone who already loves it, someone who already understands what it means for a place to hold people up." I did not understand what he was saying at first, and then I did, and I started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the specific quiet cry of someone who has been seen so completely and so unexpectedly that their body responds before their mind can catch up. He left me the building. Not in a rushed decision. It took months, lawyers, proper documentation, everything done carefully and correctly. He had thought about it for years. He told me later in one of our last conversations that he had made up his mind not long after a particular Tuesday when I had been upset. I hadn't said anything, but he could tell, and I had still sat with him for an hour and asked him about his life instead of talking about my own problems. He said, "That is a person who understands what buildings are really for. They're not for the owners. They're for the people inside them." Edmund Park passed away 9 months ago. I sat with him near the end. I held his hand. I told him about my grandmother, and he smiled and said they sounded similar. I think they were. He left me the building. And I had been the building's owner for 31 days when Greg Calloway decided that a Tuesday morning staff meeting was the perfect time to end my career. I want to describe that morning to you carefully because the details matter. I had been at my desk since 7:45. I had already, before anyone else arrived, handled 3 urgent emails, fixed a scheduling conflict for the senior partner's client lunch, and replaced the toner on the 8th floor because the office manager had been out sick for 2 days and nobody else had figured out the cartridge system, despite being, several of them, grown adults with graduate degrees. This is not bitterness. This is just Tuesday. Greg had been in a bad mood for 2 weeks. The company had lost a significant client, Harmon Retail Group, a relationship worth about 8% of annual revenue, and the loss had happened on Greg's watch, under a campaign strategy Greg had personally overseen and personally overpromised. The mood in the office had the specific quality of a building where someone had left the gas on. Everyone could sense something was wrong, but nobody wanted to be the one to strike a match. The all-staff meeting was called at 10 o'clock. All-staff meetings at Calloway and Pierce were rare enough that when the calendar invites went out the previous afternoon, the murmuring started immediately. Something was happening. People adjusted their body language in preparation, the particular corporate stiffness that comes when you sense an authority figure is about to perform authority. We filled into the large conference room, 43 people. Greg stood at the head of the table. He had his jacket on, which he usually only wore for clients, and I noted it the way I note everything, not with alarm, just with attention. He talked for about 12 minutes about the company's direction, about the need for recalibration, about a return to the culture of excellence that had made Calloway and Pierce a name in this industry. I will be honest, it was not a bad speech in structure. Delivered by someone with actual authority rather than inherited title, it might even have been moving. And then he looked at me. It was a deliberate look, the kind that has been practiced. And he said, "Part of recalibration is honest assessment of where we have dead weight." Dead weight. I held very still.
He said that an administrative review had identified certain positions as underperforming relative to the investment. He said the company was moving toward a leaner operational model. He said some positions were being eliminated effective immediately. And then he said my name. Renata Owusu, your position is being eliminated effective today. I heard a few sharp intakes of breath around the table. Sandra Cho, my closest friend in that office, the one person who had always treated me like I was fully in the room, made a sound like she'd been struck. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Greg. He wasn't finished. I think he'd been waiting for this. I think somewhere in the dark little theater of his ego, this scene had been playing for a long time, the moment he finally, formally, officially removed the woman who made him feel seen through. He said, and I want you to hear every word of this, because I have not forgotten a single syllable. Pack your trash and get out. Today, this morning. I don't want a long goodbye. You're a coordinator, not a partner. Act accordingly. Pack your trash. You're a coordinator, not a partner. In front of 43 people. People who respected me, people whose children's names I knew, people I stayed late for, covered for, advocated for in ways that never made it into any meeting or record because that's not why I did it. In front of all of them. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't fury, not yet. It wasn't humiliation, though I could feel the secondhand embarrassment radiating off the room like heat. What I felt was something almost crystalline, a strange, cold clarity, like the world had just gone very sharp and very quiet, and everything I needed to see was suddenly perfectly visible. I thought of Edmund. I thought of that elevator. I thought of that paper bag and that cardigan and the way he'd looked up at the ceiling and said, "It is, isn't it?" I thought of the documents in my bag, the ones my attorney had given me the week before, the ones I'd been carrying around for 31 days while I figured out what I was going to do with them. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my jacket. And I walked, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the specific pace of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to do next, to the small credenza at the side of the room where the office intercom system was mounted. I picked up the intercom handset, and the room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Greg said, "What are you doing?" I pressed the button for all floors, all 8 floors of that building, every office, every corridor, every lobby space. The intercom crackled to life, and I said in my grandmother's voice, the calm one, the one that never needed volume, "Attention everyone. This is the building owner speaking. I'd like to inform all tenants that effective immediately, I will be conducting a lease review for all current occupants of this building. Additionally, the lease agreement for the 7th and 8th floors, currently held by Callaway and Pierce, is hereby under formal review pending renegotiation. I'd like all parties in the main conference room on the 8th floor to be aware that this process will begin today." I set the handset down. I turned around. Greg's face had moved through approximately 4 colors in the span of those 30 seconds. It had started pink, then red, then it went to a shade I can only describe as the color of someone who just understood something they very much did not want to understand, a kind of gray purple that I think was his blood pressure and his ego failing simultaneously. He said, "What did you just—" I said, "I own the building, Greg." Silence. Real silence, the kind that has texture. I reached into my bag and I placed the deed documentation on the conference room table. Not all of it. I didn't need to bury him with paper. Just enough. The cover page, the registration, my name in print as primary owner of the property at Meridian Avenue, Edmund Park's name on the transfer. The date. Sandra Cho made a sound that, under other circumstances, might have been a laugh.
Greg picked up the papers. He put them down. He picked them up again. His mouth opened and closed in a way that I found, despite everything, almost poignant. This was a man encountering for the very first time the full consequences of having spent a decade not paying attention. He said, You can't just, he stopped. He started again. The lease is, I said, the lease is month to month, Greg. It has been for the last 3 years since Edmund declined to offer a long-term renewal to any floor tenant. I have the lease terms in writing. My attorney does as well. He straightened. He tried to reassemble his authority. I could actually watch him trying to locate it, like a man patting his pockets for keys he knows he's lost. He said, You don't have the authority to just walk in here and... I walked in here, I said, 7 years ago as a coordinator. I have walked in here every single day since then, and in that entire time, you have spoken my name in a meeting exactly once, just now, when you told me to pack my trash. I looked at him steadily. I want you to think about that for a moment. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I said very clearly the thing I had decided to say. You don't fire people in their own building, Greg. What happened next unfolded over the following days and weeks, and I want to walk you through it properly because I think the aftermath is actually more important than the moment. Within 48 hours of that meeting, I had a conversation with my attorney, my very thorough, very prepared attorney named Diane, who had been advising me since Edmund's estate was finalized about the legal landscape. The lease situation was exactly as I had described. Edmund had deliberately kept Callaway and Pierce on a rolling month-to-month arrangement for the last few years of his life, and when I had asked him once why he hadn't locked them into a longer term, he had given me a small, quiet smile and said only, "Flexibility is valuable for everyone." I think he knew. I think Edmund, in his patient and unassuming way, had known for a long time that one day I would need that flexibility. Greg did attempt to argue. He hired his own attorney within 24 hours, which was actually faster than I expected. I'll give him credit for that reflexive self-preservation. The argument his attorney presented was essentially that the lease implied long-term renewal rights based on the history of occupancy. Diane took approximately 1 meeting to demonstrate through the actual documented lease terms that this argument had no foundation. There were no implied renewal rights. There never had been. Now, and I want to be clear about this because I think people assume they know what I did next, and they're usually wrong. I did not immediately terminate the lease and throw 43 people out of their offices, because those 43 people had nothing to do with what Greg had done. Sandra was one of them. There were project managers in that office who had spent years doing excellent work. There was an intern named Theo who was 22 years old and on his very first job and had made me coffee exactly the way I liked it every morning for 4 months without being asked. I was not going to burn their careers to the ground to make a point. What I did was remove Greg. I had a conversation with the board of Callaway and Pierce, the actual board, the people whose names were on the founding documents, some of whom had known Edmund and who received the news of my ownership with wide eyes and very careful expressions. I presented them with a straightforward proposal. The building lease would continue at a renegotiated rate that Diane had determined was fair and current market value, which was, for the record, significantly higher than what Edmund had been charging them out of the long-standing relationship, with one condition. Greg Callaway would step down from his position as managing director, not be demoted, not be given a different title, gone. The board met for 4 hours. They accepted.
Greg Calloway cleared out his office on a Friday afternoon. I was not there to watch. I didn't need to be. I had already moved on to other things. The building had a roof issue on the third floor that needed attention, and a ground floor tenant who wanted to expand into an adjacent vacant suite, and there was a community program Edmund had been informally funding that I was now looking at formalizing. There was a lot of work to do, and I had been sitting at other people's desks long enough. Sandra was promoted to a senior project management role within 3 months. I did not engineer that directly. I had no role in the company's internal hiring decisions, but I will not pretend I was surprised or displeased. Theo, the intern, was offered a full-time position. The office, from what Sandra tells me when we have our regular Thursday lunches at the cafe on the ground floor at Edmund's table, is a different place now, quieter in the bad ways and louder in the good ones. I've told this story now a number of times, and the part people always want to focus on is the intercom, the moment, the look on Greg's face, and I understand that. It is objectively a very satisfying image, the look on the face of someone who has just discovered that the person they most underestimated was holding something they needed all along.
But here is what I actually think about when I think about that morning. I think about Edmund in the elevator. 74 years old, cardigan, paper bag, looking up at the ceiling and loving it quietly without needing anyone to know he owned it. I spent 7 years in that building watching people perform power, watching Greg Calloway fill a room with his voice and his jacket and his deliberate pauses, making sure everyone could see that he was the authority, that he was the one who decided things, that his approval or disapproval had weight and consequence. And I watched Edmund Park own the entire structure those performances were happening inside, every floor, every ceiling, every elevator, and never once feel the need to announce it. Power that needs to be performed is borrowed power. It belongs to the room, to the audience, to the moment, and when those things change, it disappears. Real power, the kind my grandmother had, the kind Edmund had, doesn't need a stage. It's just there, quiet, load-bearing, holding things up without asking to be thanked. I spent 7 years being called invisible, being talked over, looked past, credited with nothing. And in that same time, I was learning everything about the building, about the business, about people, about what it looks like when someone is afraid of you and doesn't have the self-awareness to understand why. I was storing it all away in that quiet, careful way that people mistake for smallness. It isn't smallness. It's foundation. If you are listening to this right now and you are in a place that is making you feel small, a job, a relationship, a room, a system that keeps telling you that you don't have weight or worth or a right to take up space, I want to say this to you as directly as I know how. The people telling you that are usually telling you because they can feel somewhere below the level of conscious thought that you have something they don't, that your quiet has substance, that your patience is not weakness, it is accumulation. And one day, in ways you may not be able to predict right now, that accumulation becomes something undeniable. You don't have to perform power. You just have to know what you hold. Greg Calloway walked into a room intending to diminish me. He handed me a microphone instead. And the only reason that moment existed, the only reason I had anything to say into that microphone was because for 7 years while he was performing, I was paying attention. Pay attention. Stay in the room. Know what you hold. And thank you genuinely, completely for listening to every word of this. If this story landed somewhere in you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Tell me what you're holding right now that no one else can see. I'll be reading. I always am.